Hey everyone, sorry I had my mute button on. Anyway, I am Charles Chamberlain, author of New Orleans, A Concise History of an Exceptional City with LSU Press. And I want to thank James Wilson for organizing this event here, in which we'll discuss the book. But we're just going to wait a couple minutes and then start just basically in a couple minutes. We're going to wait for a few people to join in here. So I'll see y'all in a couple minutes. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Charles Chamberlain, author of the book New Orleans, A Concise History of an Exceptional City with LSU Press. And once again, I want to thank James Wilson with LSU Press for organizing this event. I'll be basically presenting the book and talking about the book over the next 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for question and answers. And I want to thank you all for attending this book. It's very exciting to be able to promote this book that I've been writing for the last couple of years. But first of all, I wanted to introduce myself and let you all know a little bit about me. I am a historian and a tour guide and a professor at UNO, as well as a food and music lover and a musician. And all of this goes into the writing of the book. As a historian, I have a PhD from Tulane, where I focused in U.S. history. And then in 2002, I became the historian for the Louisiana State Museum, for which I served for 10 years. And I must say, a lot of the book content comes from questions that people asked over the years. I would often give tours of the Cabildo or the collections, and I heard so many interesting questions over time that I built up a base of knowledge. And so all that knowledge is poured out into this book. And then also as a tour guide, I became a tour guide in about 2012. And so I've given all kind of tours and all over the city and all over South Louisiana, even in fact. So it's one of my great loves to do that, and I really treat that particular profession as like a classroom without walls. And then also, I'm a professor for the University of New Orleans, where I teach New Orleans history, New Orleans music history. In the past, I also taught Louisiana history and public history, which is the study of the way the public engages in history, which also plays in to the book, especially in terms of the way I include historic sites for people to engage with and also recipes. So, let me go ahead and really kind of give you an overview of the book. First of all, I want to let you all know why I wrote the book, and that is because people had suggested, oh gosh, I don't know, in the probably the late 2010s, that given my knowledge base, that I should write a book that is comprehensive of New Orleans history, and yet is scholarly and trustworthy. And coming from the museum profession, where we create exhibits that appeal to a very broad audience in terms of the language and the style. I really wanted to make a book, write a book that would appeal to a broad audience. So this is not an academic book. I really want to be able to appeal this book to everyone, regardless of your background, regardless of your interests. And as I write in the introduction, I kind of wrote it in mind for everyday readers who may be curious about the history of New Orleans and are interested in a book that encapsulates the complete history, all the way from pre-colonialism, the indigenous period, to the present. And so I think I've accomplished that here. And also, again, as I mentioned, each chapter includes a list of historic sites relevant to the subject at hand. And then also each chapter includes a recipe with basically a meal or a dish that is relevant to the chapter as well. So let me just go ahead and provide an overview of the book's content. Number one, the intro basically focuses on the question, is New Orleans exceptional? And let me hold the book up for a minute. So here it is, New Orleans, A Concise History of an Exceptional City. You can see this beautiful cover. It shows Jackson Square at sunset, and I love this type of imagery. It's probably taken in the summer where there's a beautiful sunset and yet the lights are on in the foreground. Beautiful composition, also showing the historic sites of St. Louis Cathedral, the Cabildo, and the Presbytery as well. And so in the introduction, I raised the question, is New Orleans exceptional? And what I like to tell my students or raise the questions is New Orleans as a city that identifies with a Creole culture is often viewed as exceptional within the United States because it's so different in terms of its Catholic history, its strong Latin American and Caribbean connections. And within the United States, it is very different. And that is exemplified by, our carnival customs or the second line parade tradition or Mardi Gras Indians, these customs that are only found in the United States, as well as many of our culinary traditions. But I also argue that in the larger Creole world, and this is the larger Atlantic Creole world, including Latin America, the Caribbean, parts of the coast of West Africa, as well as Western Europe and the Mediterranean basin, New Orleans is actually one of many communities that share these attributes. A celebration of carnival, a strong Catholic background, and a distinct cuisine that is manifestation of all of the cultures that have moved to the city. So I still want to emphasize that I do raise the question, is New Orleans exceptional? And it's really open to conjecture. And I will say that there are some people who say, no, New Orleans is just another American city. I've heard it many times. A lot of my students tire of the mantle of exceptionalism. But you have other people who really love this city and they view it as such a distinct city that they view it as exceptional. So I'll leave it up to you to figure it out. And indeed, I do lay the case for raising the question of exceptionalism throughout the book. So there are basically 8 chapters overall, stretching from the indigenous period, the chapter 1 called Bulbancha, all the way to chapter 8, which is called Ain't Dare No More, which really looks at New Orleans from Katrina to the present. And then there's an epilogue which raises the question, where will we celebrate the 400th anniversary of the city? So let me just kind of quickly cover some of the chapters and some of the highlights. So Bulbancha really looks at New Orleans as an indigenous crossroads, and that is the location is very important at the mouth of the Mississippi where it meets the Gulf Coast, is really a major trade crossroads for indigenous people at a time when there was trade going on throughout North America and the Caribbean. And I love to raise the question about what Iberville discovered when he came to the site of the future New Orleans in 1699. And he basically makes the claim that he came to the site of where the French Quarter is, and he sees that it's an abandoned basically village site and farmlands of the Quinipissa people, who were indigenous people who lived generally on the North Shore. But I always raise the question, why did the Quinipissa abandon that site? And he says that when he arrived, he saw trees that were about 2 feet around growing in the abandoned farm fields. So that maybe would be 20 years before. So why did the Quinipissa abandon that site? No one really knows, but of course, it raises the question of environmental vulnerability, and that is river floods and hurricanes. And so the city is quite remarkable in terms of engineering a sustainable infrastructure that allows people to live permanently on this location for 300 plus years. And then in terms of the recipe, I feature the recipe of corn makshu, which is a corn-based dish, reflects its indigenous heritage, and is similar to the historic indigenous meal of sagamite, which is common throughout the eastern part of the Americas. There's variations also that are common throughout South American indigenous communities. Sagamite still today exists in Canada. But locally, we cook corn makshu, a corn-based stew that some of y'all are probably familiar with. You might identify it as Cajun, when in fact it has indigenous roots. And so, again, with the recipes, I want people to have fun. I want them to engage with the book by cooking and engaging and imbibing as they go along. So that's the chapter one, Bulbancha, an indigenous transnational crossroads. And then chapter two is the French period, and it's called A Creole Village. And this is basically looking at the French colonization period, the establishment of the town in 1718 to basically French relinquishing control of Louisiana around 1768. I really question the emphasis of how successful France was in populating the area. And just to give you an idea, by the 1760s, the town had a population of 2,500 people, essentially. When I ask my students, is that a lot of people? They say yes, but I think we can all agree that the population of a community under 3,000 people is more like a village. And so that's why I title this chapter La Nouvelle Orléans, a Creole Village. But I will also say that the village was very, very diverse ethnically and also in terms of class identity during this French period. So some of the personalities that I focus on or highlight include a woman, Madame Elizabeth Real, who lived in what is today Madame John's Legacy, the most historic residential structure in the city on Dumaine Street in the French Quarter. There's also the story of Louis Congo, who arrived in New Orleans as an enslaved man from the Congo region and then gained his freedom by agreeing to serve as the town executioner. He was given a parcel of land outside the town on Bayou Road, so representing really an interesting story of basically an African guy who gained his freedom and then also represents the capital corporal punishment that existed at that time. And then there's also Marie Hachard, an Ursuline nun who arrived in the late 1720s, and she kept letters to her father. She wrote letters to her father, excuse me, that were now published and edited by Tulane professor Emily Clark. And so these three people, just as a sample, provide really kind of a broad array of the different people that lived in the town. And indeed, France had a difficult time finding settlers for the town, despite their propaganda and their efforts to portray the town as habitable. And so basically, France relied on shipping convicts and also indentured servants, and also shipping slaves from West Africa to provide labor. And what is interesting is that the laws that are passed during this time really address the issue of wild behavior in the back of town, the back of the French Quarter at the time, really showing how French voyageurs, the guys who were fur traders or sailors or soldiers or enslaved people, all gathered together to party in the back of the French Quarter literally on present-day Burma and Dauphine. So I make the joke that really the behavior in that part of the French Quarter has not changed in over 300 years. And then the recipe that I use for chapter 1 is jambalaya. And this is, of course, exploring the influence of Senegalese people who were sent as enslaved workers from the Senegal region, where the national dish of tiboujen, basically shrimp and rice or chicken and rice, is basically the predecessor to jambalaya. Some people also might argue that it's similar to Spanish paella, but all three dishes are very similar. And the fact that Africans worked in the kitchens of colonial Louisiana really would lend one to believe that there was, of course, a strong African influence on the culinary development. So now chapter 3 is the Spanish period, Nueva Orleans, and I call it the Criollo Caribbean port. And so now the town grows. It finally expands outside of the boundaries of the original settlement, the French Quarter, and it expands upriver into Faubourg Santa Maria, which is the modern central business district. And also, one of the great legacies of the Spanish period are the two fires that occur in 1788 and 1794, in which the French Quarter is rebuilt really with a large Spanish influence, the incorporation of patios, courtyards, balconies, and buildings that come right up to the sidewalk. Again, the characteristic that gives the French Quarter its characteristic old world charm and reminds people of a European village. And then what is interesting is the first fire of 1788 actually started on Good Friday at the home of Don Vicente Nunez, who lived in the 700 block of Charters, one block from the Place d'Armes, which is Jackson Square. The fire spread quickly on a windy day in a town full of wooden buildings, but because it was Good Friday, the pastor of St. Louis Church, Père Antoine, refused to ring the bells, which is part of the Catholic doctrine of not ringing the bells on Good Friday. So the fire raged, and the story of Père Antoine is fascinating. He was actually sent by the Catholic Church to enforce the Inquisition in New Orleans. But as we've talked about already, and we know, New Orleans is a town that has often less than pious behavior. But I must admit that New Orleans is also characterized as a town that has the dichotomy of desire and piety. And so I think this dichotomy also characterizes the town as explored through the example in the story of Father Sadella and Père Antoine. And for the recipe in chapter 3, I use Spanish stuffed peppers. And of course, stuffed peppers, either stuffed with shrimp or rice or beef, is a very common meal, Creole cuisine in New Orleans. And it also has origins in Spain and the Mediterranean region. So that's the recipe that I use to reflect the Spanish period. Chapter 4 is New Orleans, the American boomtown. And it's basically a Creole American city. And I begin the chapter by describing this famous painting by the painter Boquete de Wasseri, who painted a view of the French Quarter from the front porch of Bernard de Marigny's plantation home. And it's quite remarkable. He shows the French Quarter in its kind of small size for the time. Cypress swamp is seen to the rear of the town, so right on the edge of the swamp. And in the foreground, it shows a few African people working, really to convey, according to Wasseri, the diverse cultures that characterize New Orleans from the very beginning, as well as its strong historic connections to the Caribbean and Latin America. This is a time period when New Orleans underwent extensive growth. It became the fastest growing city in the United States. It was subject to a large-scale immigration, especially from Irish, German, and French immigrants, the majority of whom by far were Catholics, so adding new Catholic layers to the city's history and culture. And also the emergence of the free person of color community, which also defined New Orleans as exceptional within the United States at that time. And that is exemplified by the histories of people like Henriette DeLille, who was a wealthy free woman of color who started the Sisters of the Holy Family and really served people in need during a time of great epidemics, the yellow fever and cholera especially. And also Margaret Howery, who was an Irish woman immigrant who was orphaned herself and became really one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the city by opening a bakery and then also funding the establishment of several orphanages which served the children who lost their parents in the yellow fever epidemics of the day. So even though Irish people were often viewed as basically common labor or not well respected within society, Margaret Howery really gained a lot of respect for that community. And then in terms of food, I do address the emergence of culinary tourism, even at this time before the American Civil War, and especially the establishment of restaurants such as Antoine's and also Tujague's. And just to say briefly, Antoine's was started by a guy named Alciatore Antoine, who was an Italian-French guy from Marseille, France, who moved to New Orleans, and then he helped, and his wife and his son also helped build up the restaurant's reputation, pioneering such dishes as oyster Rockefeller, classic Creole cuisine. And then there's also Tujague's, which has its roots as the restaurant of Madame Begay, who's often given credit for being the founder of brunch. She's considered by some historians to be the first celebrity chef. And basically what she did is she built on the idea that came out of Germany and Central Europe of having a big second breakfast at the end of the morning for those guys who are working, especially on the waterfront. Let's see, I'm trying to look at my notes here. So that brings us now to chapter 5, which covers from the Civil War to 1910. And so I call this chapter the Simmering Gumbo Pot. And this is really a reflection of the social tensions that define this era of a new era of immigration, especially from Southern Europe, the Mediterranean basin, and also Eastern Europe, as well as the beginning of formal racial segregation at the time. And so the social tensions blew up in a number of incidents. Number one would be the big riot of 1866, following the Civil War, when African Americans demanded their right to vote and equality. And this led to a riot and a backlash by conservative whites. And then you had the lynching of the 11 Italians in 1891 based on social reactions to the existence of Italians, similar to the way that society viewed the Irish before the Civil War. And then thirdly is the Robert Charles riot of 1900. But that's not to say that New Orleans didn't go on exist on a day-to-day basis where everyone got along. That I think these riots reflect the social tensions that existed. But in terms of everyone getting along, this is also a time period when we have the birth of modern carnival. Rex is born, as well as Zulu, in the context of segregation. And then in terms of recipes, I actually use the recipe of grilled oysters to reflect Croatian Creole. Whereas I could have chosen a recipe that reflected more Sicilian influences, I thought it was important to acknowledge the immigration of Croatian people and the basis of the modern oyster industry that exists today. And then grilled oysters as a reflection of this immigration and development of a Creole cuisine. Then chapter number 6 is the birthplace of jazz, speaks for itself from 1910 to 1950, focusing really on the history of Louis Armstrong as a strong personality, which reflects a lot of the social developments and also incidents at the time, including his experiences during World War I. The closing of Storyville, the red light district, the birth of jazz itself, as well as the existence of racial segregation. And it's a time when New Orleans and boosters viewed the city as one that really mixed modern and the Creole past. And so they really wanted to be modern by building large new office buildings. The railroads were very prominent. They built new bridges, of course, and new highways, but at the same time, tourism boosters marketed the Creole past the old world charm to attract people to the city, tourists to the city, and then also define its exceptionalism within a modernizing, very suburban, commercialized U.S. economy. And then the main recipe from this chapter, chapter 6, is red beans and rice. Louis Armstrong's favorite meal. But even the history of red beans and rice is fascinating. Roots in southern France, roots in Central Africa, the Congo region, also roots in the Caribbean in terms of Haiti and Cuba. And one of the iconic dishes in New Orleans today, where Louis Armstrong actually had his own recipe, and he often signed his letters red beans and rice lieurs. And also, it's important to acknowledge the importance of the banana trade during this time. This is the rise of United Fruit and Standard Fruit, the two top banana importing companies in the world, both based out of New Orleans. And basically, their evolution reflects New Orleans' strong connections to Latin America. And also, coming out of that, we have recipes such as Bananas Foster, which was invented by the Brennan's family after World War II. So now that brings us to chapter 7, America's Most Interesting City, covering from 1950 to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And this covers the demise of segregation during the 1960s, especially, the emergence of modern tourism and the so-called Disneyfication of the French Quarter, as well as a growing movement of preservation in the city for those preservationists who really wanted to basically protect the neighborhood infrastructure and the unique architecture that defines New Orleans and is still a draw to this day in terms of colonial architecture in the French Quarter and antebellum architecture in the Garden District and the older neighborhoods in the town, and as well as shotgun homes and Creole cottages throughout the city. So, also, this is a time when we have yet a third wave of immigrants, and especially from Latin America and from East Asia, and that would really be the Vietnamese community that grows following the Vietnamese War, and first settling in the Michoud area of New Orleans East, and then basically becoming suburbanized all across the city. And based on their experience, the recipe for chapter 7 is that of the banh mi sandwich, which basically reflects our love of po' boy French bread, and also a love for grilled pork and strong spices. So the banh mi again reflects the evolution of city during this period. And then coming to chapter 8, the final chapter, it's called Ain't Dare No More, reflecting the Benny Grunch and the Bunch song that talks about the changes that have come to the city really since Katrina, essentially. And also, this is in the context of Benny Grunch and the Bunch come out of this cultural phenomenon that we now know as Yat. And this is basically New Orleans' distinct accent and distinct neighborhood culture. Yat, of course, refers to the greeting, the iconic New Orleans greeting, where you at? And so the 1970s and 80s, this is the birth of Yat culture. But then after Katrina, especially, people recognize that the city has changed so much through the growth of tourism and also through gentrification that they're asking the question, ain't there no more? Where is it? And so then, of course, the chapter covers Katrina and recovery and the way the city changes, again, through gentrification. And then the recipe for this chapter reflects the gentrification of food. And the recipe I focus on is that of yakameen, the soup that used to be found only at basically markets and corner stores in Black neighborhoods, and now is become accepted as a mainstream food. And Miss Linda Green, who's still around, is one of the great purveyors of this dish, and now it's gone mainstream as a reflection of the changes that happen. And then, in conclusion, in the epilogue, again, I asked the question, where will New Orleans celebrate its 400th anniversary? Really looking at the issue of rising sea levels, the vulnerability the city faces to hurricanes, and everyday monsoon floods. How does a city continue to be sustainable in this environment? And then also the issues that many coastal communities are facing, and that is with distinct Cajun cultures or Creole cultures on the coast. With rising sea levels, you're actually starting to see people leave the coast and move further northward. We actually saw that after Katrina with people in St. Bernard Parish relocating to St. Tammany Parish. And now we see it with indigenous people in the marshes south of Homa also having to move north. So, can you relocate culture to a new location? And this really kind of raises the big question in terms of New Orleans exceptionalism. Is the sacred ground of New Orleans so special that the customs can only survive there, or can we actually transfer them? So, with that, I will go ahead and open it up to questions. James, do you want to jump in here and
Yeah,
moderate
sure.
the questions?
Absolutely. Thank you, Charles. That was very informative. Great introduction to the book. Um, we have a two-part question from Suzanne. One, a little off topic, but what instrument do you play?
Well, generally I play guitar, but I play many string instruments. And for 20 years, I played guitar with the New Leviathan Oriental Foxtrot Orchestra, which, if y'all are familiar with that orchestra, it basically started as an orchestra that played music from the 19 teens and 20s and what I would call the roots of jazz. So ragtime, tangos, one steps and two steps, and the early foxtrots.
And the follow-up, a little more specific to the book. Do we know specifically where Louis Congo lived, more than just Bayou Road?
That's a great question. I don't, and I look at there's a couple early maps from the Spanish period that show some settlements along Bayou Road right outside the French Quarter. So I'm guessing, I mean, we don't know for sure, but those could be the residences or the residential area of Louis Congo. And if that's the case, it would basically be Governor Nichols in the French Quarter becomes the old Chemin de Bayou, which is the Bayou Path. So I often look at especially those first few blocks of Governor Nichols in the Tremaine neighborhood and surmise about the location of Louis Congo. And I will say that those first couple blocks of Governor Nichols and the Treme have some of the finest examples of Creole cottages. And Creole cottages are generally the first kind of vernacular middle class style architecture in the city. And while I don't believe those cottages are that of Louis Congo, it is very interesting in terms of representing this important architectural development in the city. So, great question. I wish I knew
I'll
more.
uh, I'll weigh in with an alternative theory here, Charles, because
Yeah,
I've got a little expertise in this. But Congo, if you look at the records of the Superior Council, he often petitioned them about him being a target because he was the executioner, which also doled out punishments. And so
right.
I would speculate he probably lived a little bit outside the city in terms to get away from, to be more secluded and try to get a little bit further out. It's interesting though that the records that we have of him are through the Superior Council complaints, basically about him being targets over and over. Um,
Um, That's a great observation. Thanks, James.
Here's one I have for you, Charles. And it's a two-parter again. What is the most common question that you would get from either students or on your tours? And then what about some of the misconceptions that you may hear from people that, is part of the reasons that you wrote the book?
Yeah, I think one of the most common questions that is a real base question is what is Creole? How do you define Creole? And this is a subject that is quite complex as it's one word that has evolved in different definitions over time and in many different places. And then just kind of a quick survey of the evolution of the word is that it initially started out as a Portuguese and Spanish word criollo, which identified someone born in the Americas, irregardless of their race or ethnicity. And then over time in New Orleans became identified with the French or Spanish speaking Catholic population who viewed themselves very differently from the new English-speaking Protestant Americans who came in after 1803. And then today, we generally identify it, as you all are probably aware, with cuisine, architecture, sometimes people and culture, as well as language. And so, I mean, it's a really good question. It's so complex that I'm still exploring it all the time, and I think it's a fascinating question. In terms of misconceptions, as a tour guide, there are so many that you see in the tourism industry, and I'll just mention a few. One is the casket girls, who were basically described by tourism industry in the 20th century as young ladies sent from France who had everything in their basically their small wooden box, which was translated from French as the casket, when in fact the French word is cassette, like basically an audio device. When in fact the casket girls landed in Biloxi, and I often wondered, why does the city promote this legend? And I think partly it's because in the French period, through the forced immigration of convicts and women who were labeled as prostitutes, that people who wanted to promote tourism wanted to give a basically a nicer view of the original settlers, as the truth was too offensive. Another couple legendary figures who I think are subject to hyperbole and legend and myth are Marie Laveau and also John Lafitte. So Marie Laveau, the whole definition of voodoo is also quite complex, but basically it stems from a mixture, a syncretic blend in scholarly terms of African animist beliefs, of worshiping ancestors and spirits, and also the Catholic doctrine. And so this is a Afro-Creole religion that developed in New Orleans. In my personal view, voodoo is more associated with Haiti. So what developed in New Orleans is really more of a distinct Afro-Creole belief without an obvious name. But Marie Laveau is a fascinating character. She was a free woman of color in the 19th century and was definitely revered for her spiritual practices. And generally, what we find is when you read the biographers of her, is that she basically offered blessings and helpful advice to people to live a better life. In terms of John Lafitte, indeed, there was a privateer or a pirate named John Lafitte. Oftentimes, if you're standing at the corner of St. Philip and Bourbon, you'll hear buggy drivers drive by that bar there, John Lafitte's blacksmith shop, and say, John Lafitte operated this bar. It's the longest continually operating bar in the U.S. Not true. It's a great legend. His brother Pierre had a girlfriend who lived across the street, and that's kind of the connection. But John Lafitte was not a blacksmith. And indeed, the bar has only operated since the 1930s, since the era of Prohibition. Another great legend is Madame LaLaurie. Her legend has also been blown out of control. There's a great book called Mad Madame LaLaurie that explores that legend, but you often hear that in the ghost tours. And then a last one that I'll mention is the history of Irish workers dying in the building of the New Basin Canal. Even the Cabildo, the State Museum, had a claim that 30,000 Irish workers died, when in fact, Terence Fitzmaurice, the professor of Irish history at Tulane, we had a conversation about this, and he says probably several hundred died of cholera, but by no means the huge inflated numbers that were put out by people who are sympathetic to the Irish cause. So, I mean, those are just a few kind of scratching the surface of the misconceptions.
Yeah, I really like the example of Marie Laveau because she's most known for one aspect of her life, but really she serves as this great example of free women of color and the power that they were able to obtain, you know. And so she serves this larger historical role that was very, you know, somewhat common in New Orleans, but not, you don't initially think of her that way. And I don't think most people would connect the dots there.
Yeah, and I would even add to that that it's only been in the last 10 years or so that free women of color, as entrepreneurs, as important social people, have really gotten their due. Oftentimes, they were kind of overlooked in the history of the quadroon balls. Oftentimes, there's a hotel on Orleans Street that is characterized as a place of quadroon balls, in which women of basically one quarter African ancestry would meet with wealthy white men to form the contract of plissage. And in fact, Emily Clark, the historian at Tulane, has explored this in great detail in her book, The Strange Career of the American Quadroon, says there's no evidence of plissage. And in fact, the majority of free women of color married within their community in the Catholic Church. They were basically conservative people who wanted to be mainstream. They're not going to be farmed out to be the mistress of a wealthy white man. So it's good to see that change come to the tourism industry overall.
Yeah, and I think the real pivot is another connection to your position at the as historian state museum. Kim Hanger's book, Bound Lives, Bound Places, was the one that really set the that pivot in terms of focusing on the free blacks in Spanish colonial Louisiana. So
Yes.
shout out to two great books there. Um,
Yeah.
Paul asked, what recipe would you associate with the Battle of New Orleans? And do you cover the white insurrection post-Civil War that General Longstreet was involved with? I'm guessing Battle of Liberty Place is what he's talking about there.
Yeah, I do mention the Battle of Liberty Place as an example of the conservative white Democrats retaking political power at the time and basically the end of Reconstruction. In terms of recipe at the Battle of New Orleans, gosh, that's a really good question. I would say it's probably something along the lines of maybe like a corn maque choux, something that could be made with a filling protein grain like corn that you could also add meat or rice to, something like that. But that's a really good question. And what I'm thinking is actually, if you ever go out to the Chalmette battlefield for the reenactments on January 8th, you will actually have the reenactors cooking food there. But that's a great question. And, I'm trying to think of something easy that would be able to cook on the battlefield that would also be fulfilling, or excuse me, filling, and then provide some energy and protein to the soldiers there. So great question.
Well, again, I'll present my alternative theory. I would go with the way the Kentucks and Jackson's troops, and maybe say we should roast some squirrels up while we're out there over the campfire.
For
Uh,
sure. And I what
Here's
I was
yeah, go
gonna
ahead, Charles.
say, the Johnny Horton song, doesn't he say that they shot rabbits as well? So
There you
let's
go.
rabbit there.
Talk about bringing Louisiana history to the masses.
Yeah, exactly.
Here's one that's hits kind of close to home for you. Melissa asked, Melissa Daggett, who, by the way, has a book coming out with LSU Press, I think, soon. Um, I live on Chamberlain Street in New Orleans. Do you know the origins of the street name?
Oh gosh, that's a really good one. I don't even think I know where Chamberlain Street is. Is it in New Orleans East?
Let's see if maybe Melissa will post in the comments there. Um, but while we're giving her a chance to post there, how about talking about a little bit about your sources? Did you do any archival research for the book, or was it mostly secondhand monographs and synthesis kind of research?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So throughout my career, I actually worked at the Hogan Jazz Archives. I spent a lot of time at the Louisiana Historic Center doing research, especially for the great number of exhibits that I curated at the State Museum. So this is partly how I accumulated all this knowledge. For the book itself, I really did not go back into the archives, but what I tried to do was promote the great monographs, which one could access to learn more about the subjects. And so I will say that for my colleagues who are all very knowledgeable New Orleans historians, they probably will not appreciate this book because they know a lot of this information already. But really, it's for people who are not familiar with a lot of the monographs or maybe for a certain era. And so in the footnotes, in the sources, I really try to direct people for a deeper dive into the specific histories that I discuss. And, for a book of, say, 300 pages and 8 chapters, a lot of times I just didn't have the time. And I also didn't want to get bogged down in a lot of the great details of specific events. So that's why I wanted to kind of keep it on a level that was easy to read and which, the progress of history moved at a decent pace. So, and, basically I encourage people to really, if they're interested, when they're reading a section, go to the footnotes, see the sources that I cite, and then buy that source or check it out at the library and learn more about it.
How about any monographs that you might recommend? Some of your favorite monographs on the history of the city?
Yeah, I think I think two of the top ones that I would recommend for kind of a broader history are Richard Campanella's Bienville's Dilemma, and I think a big shout out to Richard. I think he's really the premier New Orleans historian now. Very high profile and does a lot of research in the archives. And so every time he writes something, it's based on some amazing research that he's done. So my hat's off to Rich for just being an active, amazing historian, always coming up with new ideas and digging down deep. The second book would probably be Lawrence Powell's The Accidental City. And that really covers up until the early 19th century. So it's not a complete history. But for the early part of the history, I really recommend it. And I've heard that he's writing a follow-up to that book. James and I were talking about it. James claims that it's actually going to be a precursor to Accidental City. I had also heard from Larry Powell that there was going to be basically a follow-up to Accidental City and take us up to the Huey Long era. So again, my book is an attempt to basically kind of combine it all together, including the pre-colonial picture, because I think that's very important to acknowledge the indigenous presence. So Richard Campanella's Bienville's Dilemma and Lawrence Powell's Accidental City. And I will say it's interesting because after Lawrence Powell published his book, the former president of Tulane, Scott Cowan, wrote a book, Inevitable City, really kind of a post-Katrina ode to the city. And in my epilogue, I basically acknowledged that New Orleans is an accidental and inevitable city. So that it's really both.
Yeah, no, Larry's, it's not a precursor. It's a Napoleonic era,
Okay.
Napoleon and his relationship to the New World. And so it's not just on New Orleans or Louisiana. It's that whole international episode with New Orleans trying to be at the epicenter of everything that was happening. So
All right.
we're
Okay.
we're we're waiting on that one, Larry. Um,
Yeah.
and okay, Melissa weighed in on Chamberlain. It runs parallel to Paris Avenue going out towards UNO between Paris and the canal there.
Wow. And honestly, I'm not familiar with Chamberlain Street. Now you've got me really curious. When I would ride my bike out to UNO to go teach, I went out Paris and Saint Bernard a lot, so I know that area really well. I'm surprised I'd never come across that street, and I'm kind of curious to know of the name source of it. Historically, one of the most famous Chamberlains, at least as related to New Orleans, would be Joshua Chamberlain, the Union General. But yeah, I would. I'm very
Well,
curious. And I would love to know more.
it's interesting because the two streets that also run next to it are Chatham and Charlotte, and there's also a Charleston right there. So
Oh,
maybe it was just alliterative when they were naming those streets.
that wouldn't surprise me. So yeah, that's a great idea.
Well, one question we like to ask our authors is, well, what are you working on next? What are you doing now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm writing my next book is really a reflection of the other class I currently teach at the University of New Orleans, which is the history of New Orleans music and dance. And so this has been a great love of mine from, gosh, my undergrad days. And as I mentioned, I worked in the Hogan Jazz Archives for a number of years in the late 90s and 2000s under curator Bruce Rayburn. And I learned so much working there. And in the Hogan Jazz Archives, now under Melissa Weber, DJ Soul Sister, has really broadened its focus to include all of New Orleans music. And even back then, it included varieties of music outside of jazz. And so that's where I like really got my basis of understanding New Orleans music. Playing with New Leviathan Oriental Foxtrot Orchestra for 20 years also helped me. And basically experiencing New Orleans culture, going to festivals and second lines, and having a number of great friends who are musicians has really given me a strong basis of knowledge on this topic. And so I'm about halfway through. I'm right up to the jazz era. So I'm hoping I will be done writing it in probably the late winter, early spring, if I can dedicate some time to it while teaching. So that's my next project. I'm very excited about it.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Charles. And thank you for being here today. You want to go ahead and wrap things up and tell everyone goodbye?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, James. I really appreciate you hosting this event. It's been a pleasure talking to you all. And again, here's the book, New Orleans, A Concise History of an Exceptional City. I'm very curious to know, do y'all think it's exceptional? And I'll raise that question over and over to my students and friends. And so I hope y'all are able to get a copy of the book. I believe James says he's going to post a discount code in the comments. So be sure and get that code so you can get a reduced cost on the copy from LSU Press. So thank you once again, James.